Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to crack open the source material, get right to the core, and give you that foundational knowledge you're looking for. And today, we're not looking at some quiet, gentle historical transition. No, we're diving deep into what our sources, pretty much all of them, call the crucible of Middle English identity.
That's right. That phrase, the crucible, it's spot on, really. We're talking about the roughly 4 centuries between, the defining violence of 1066 and the start of the print age, around 1500. This is this incredibly volatile period where modern English, the whole idea of an English nation, and even some of our core sort of psychological frameworks were hammered out, forged violently and vibrantly. It was a time of really creative destruction.
Okay, creative destruction. Let's unpack that. Because I think a lot of us, when we think Middle English, maybe we jump straight to Chaucer, right? The period leading up to him sounds like it was just immense trauma and chaos. Can you set the scene for us? Say, right after the conquest, what was daily life like in that environment?
Yeah, imagine standing maybe on a busy London dock or in a market square, maybe early 13th century. It's a place just defined by friction, linguistically, socially. You'd hear 3 distinct languages, and each one immediately tells you about the speaker's power, their position in society. You might hear a Norman lord barking orders at his men in French. Maybe his clerk is calculating something nearby in Latin. But the farmer who's just brought his wool to sell, he's speaking English, a thick regional English dialect, most likely. This wasn't just, a bilingual city. It was a systemic collision. Classes, cultures, languages, all rubbing up against each other constantly. It created this continuous underlying stress, both social and psychological.
Okay, so our mission here, it's got to go way beyond just listing words borrowed from French, hasn't it? We need to figure out how these 3 centuries of conquest and, displacement and then catastrophic plague, how did all that result in the language we have now? This incredibly flexible hybrid.
That's exactly the goal. How did the, quote, broken tongue of a conquered people, how did that eventually become this really robust, complex engine, capable of, high velocity 1 minute and body jokes the next? And to really get that resilience, we have to start right at the moment of rupture, 1066, the Norman Conquest.
Which, as the sources really stress, wasn't just swapping one king for another. It was a total systemic overhaul, a regime change, basically, that just instantly swept away the entire Anglo-Saxon ruling class, lords, bishops, the whole lot, replaced them with French speakers. So within a generation, the people owning the land, running the courts, leading the armies, they spoke a language the vast majority of people couldn't understand.
Absolutely, a complete replacement at the top. And this takeover, it immediately set up what historians call the three-tongued kingdom. It was this really rigid linguistic system, and it was designed specifically to enforce that new social hierarchy. And it lasted for centuries. It was effectively the machinery of subjugation.
How did that even work? How does an elite govern a whole country when they don't speak the language? What was the system they imposed to keep those 3 languages, strictly in their lanes?
The segregation was pretty absolute. It created this power triangle, you could say. At the very top, the absolute peak, you had Latin. That was the language of the universal church, wasn't it?
Right.
And the highest levels of law, administration, all serious scholarship. It represented ultimate sort of timeless authority. Below that, you had Norman French, or Anglo-Norman as it developed. That was the practical language of power. The court, day-to-day government, the new high culture, and crucially, the nobility, the landowners.
Okay, and then right down at the bottom of that period.
Right at the bottom, you had English, the vernacular, the language spoken by the overwhelming majority, farmers, tradespeople, common soldiers. It survived, of course, but mostly just as a spoken language, often seen as, debased, common. It fractured into lots of regional dialects because there was no central standard. It was confined mostly to the home, the fields, the marketplace.
And this massive split, this linguistic hierarchy, it created something historians call the Norman yoke, right? This feeling.
Exactly, the Norman yoke. It's this persistent, almost inherited folk memory, especially among the common people, that their ancient liberties, their rights, their whole sense of national dignity had been crushed under foreign rule. Our sources really emphasize this. It created a deep psychology of subservience. For generations, just hearing French spoken in a position of authority was this constant audible reminder of your lower place in the pecking order. It really amounted to a kind of collective cultural and linguistic trauma.
Wow, a constant systemic humiliation, almost. But here's the paradox, isn't it? The really fascinating linguistic twist, the aha moment maybe for us looking back. What actually happened to the English language itself while it was, in retreat, while it was seen as debased and isolated?
This is where the story gets really interesting. Its weakness in a way, became its greatest strength. Because the ruling class didn't speak English, and they certainly didn't care about maintaining its complicated grammar, the language started to simplify radically. You see, Old English, before the conquest, was a highly inflected language.
Okay, hang on. Explain that for us quickly. What does highly inflected mean in practical terms?
Think about languages like, say, Latin or ancient Greek. Maybe modern German still has elements of this. Inflections are those specific endings you tack onto words, usually nouns or adjectives, to show their grammatical job in the sentence. Is it the subject, the object? Is it possessive? Like domus, domi, domum in Latin. Each ending tells you its role. And because those endings did all the grammatical heavy lifting, Old English could be much more flexible with its word order than modern English is.
Right, so what happened to all those complicated endings under the Norman yoke when English wasn't being formally written or taught?
Well, they basically collapsed. Now, it's crucial to say this process had already started before 1066. Old English inflections were already simplifying, particularly in areas like the Danelaw, where there was an intense contact with Old Norse speakers. Another Germanic language with simpler endings. But the Norman Conquest massively accelerated this simplification. It just wiped out the official structures, the trained scribes, the schools, the centralized royal court that might have preserved that complex system. So when people spoke English quickly, especially if they weren't native speakers or were learning it imperfectly, all those different subtle endings just blurred together. They mostly collapsed into this indistinct, weak vowel sound. Linguists call it the schwa, like the A in about.
Okay, so if all the endings started sounding the same, the spoken language couldn't rely on them anymore to figure out who was doing what to whom.
Exactly. You couldn't hear the difference clearly. This forced a really revolutionary change. English had to abandon its reliance on word endings. Instead, it shifted towards becoming an analytic language. That means it had to rely much more heavily on strict word order, usually subject, verb, object, like we have today, and also on the increased use of prepositions, little words like to, from, in, with, to show relationships between words. This simplification, which at the time probably looked like decay, like the language falling apart, it was actually the key evolutionary leap. It's what made English so adaptable, so flexible, and ultimately so successful globally.
So the trauma of conquest actually streamlined the language's engine, made it leaner, more functional. And speaking of that official decline, the sources give us that incredible legal fact that just underscores how deeply the conqueror's languages were embedded in the actual machinery of the state.
Oh, the time lag is just staggering. For almost 300 years after 1066, 3 centuries, all major court proceedings, important legal documents, official discussions in Parliament, they were all conducted and recorded in either French or Latin. It wasn't until the Pleading in English Act of 1362 that English was finally officially recognized for use in Parliament and the higher courts. That marks a huge cultural shift, obviously, but it also just highlights the incredible lifespan of that linguistic subjugation at the highest levels.
Okay, so English survives down among the common people. It simplifies, it gets more functional. But this situation, this linguistic hierarchy, it couldn't last forever, could it? What were the big shocks, the political events that finally pushed the French-speaking nobility, the descendants of the conquerors, to start looking back towards English, to reconnect with the language of the land they now ruled?
Yeah, the tide really started to turn around the mid-13th century, maybe a bit later. And it was driven mostly by big geopolitical events, things happening on the world stage that forced the Norman elite in England to basically decide where their loyalties truly lay. The first really major shock was the loss of Normandy in 1204. King John, famously, lost pretty much all the ancestral lands back in France. Suddenly, all those aristocrats in England, who also held titles and lands in Normandy, they couldn't easily do that anymore. They couldn't just pop across the channel. They were forced to commit, to choose. Were they French lords who happened to own land in England, or were they English lords with French ancestry? Their economic and political future was now tied firmly to England. They started to see themselves primarily as English landowners.
Right, that makes sense. Ties to the continent are severed, so they have to bed down in England. And the second big shock that really hammered home this emerging English identity, that was the Hundred Years' War, starting in 1337.
Absolutely. Nothing builds national identity like a long war against a clear enemy, does it? Fighting France decade after decade fostered this fierce growing sense of English nationalism. And crucially, the French language itself started to be rebranded. It wasn't just the language of the court anymore. It was the language of the enemy. the people we were fighting, the people we were raising taxes to fight against. This made it not just acceptable, but actually politically and socially advantageous, even patriotic, for the nobility to start speaking English again more publicly. It helped reconnect the rulers with the ruled, building that sense of shared purpose against the French.
And what's so fascinating here linguistically is that instead of English just replacing French or vice versa, this collision, this reconnection, it created this enormous explosion in vocabulary. Our sources talk about the layered lexicon. That's what gives modern English its staggering size and its incredible ability to express subtle shades of meaning.
That nuance really is the superpower of this hybrid language. You had the Anglo-Saxon core, that tough, simplified survivor language providing the basic concrete words. The words for everyday things: home, the body, the field. Ask, want, hide, house, head, arm. Simple, direct words. Then, pouring it on top, you have this huge influx of French vocabulary, often more formal, abstract, related to law, government, cooking, fashion. Demand, desire, conceal, mansion, face, limb. The result is what linguists call synonym duplication, or often near synonym triplets when you add in Latin later. It's this layering that lets us fine-tune our tone so precisely today. Are you asking or requesting or demanding?
And we have that brilliant classic sociological example that just perfectly illustrates the class divide embedded in this vocabulary mixing, the one about the farm animals.
Ah, yes, the classic. It's such a vivid illustration. Think about the animals when they're alive out in the field. The person looking after them, the common laborer, the Anglo-Saxon farmer, used the English words: cow, pig, sheep, calf, deer. But when the animal is killed and cooked and appears on the table of the Norman lords, the word for the meat is French-derived. Beef from bœuf, pork from pork, mutton from mouton, veal from veal, venison from venison. It's like an audible map of the social structure baked right into the language. It tells you instantly who is doing the farming and who is doing the eating, a constant linguistic reminder of the class barrier.
An inherited linguistic snapshot of feudalism, really. And you see that same kind of authority divide reflected elsewhere, too, don't you? That separation between sort of personal, gut-level experience and formal legal power.
Absolutely. The sources point to lots of examples. Think about the difference between asking for forgiveness. That's an Anglo-Saxon-derived word, isn't it? Simple, heartfelt, a personal plea for mercy, maybe from God or another person. Compare that to an official granting a pardon. That's Norman French-derived. It's a formal, legal act. It carries the weight of the law, of official authority. The language you used, or maybe even the language you could use, instantly signal your social standing, your access to power, your education level.
This linguistic layering, this code switching almost, brings us to the psychological state of the upper classes during much of this period. Scholars talk about diglossia, right? This idea of having a kind of bilingual mind, living a split life through language.
They really did, especially in the first couple of centuries after the conquest. French was, essentially, the language of your official self. It was the language you used at court, the language for legal documents, for displaying public power and sophistication. But English, even for the nobility, often remained the language of the intimate self. It was the language you spoke at home, with your family, maybe with your closest friends, the language for jokes, for anger, for giving orders to servants, or, talking to the dogs. This deep psychological split meant the elite were constantly navigating these layered identities. And this language barrier wasn't just abstract, it was a constant, audible, defining feature of the class barrier itself. They were living in a kind of continuous state of linguistic schizophrenia, you might say. One foot in the culture of the conquered, the other firmly in the culture of the conqueror.
Okay, so the stage is set for this gradual political and linguistic reunion, but it sounds like it wasn't exactly a smooth or peaceful process. If the Norman yoke was the initial trauma that forced English to simplify, maybe the arrival of the Black Death was like the fire that forged the metal, the event that accelerated everything. I mean, this catastrophe, hitting between 1347 and 1351, killing maybe up to half the population. The sources describe it as not just an epidemic, but a massive sociological and psychological earthquake.
Oh, absolutely. An existential shattering is not too strong a word. The sources are unanimous about the scale of the grief, the sheer bewilderment, and this profound crisis of meaning that just swept through society. Think about it when maybe half the people you know die horribly within 3 or 4 years. It forces a massive cognitive rupture. The old ways of understanding the world, the old social certainties, God's plan, they just didn't seem to hold anymore.
And you see that psychological fallout really clearly in things like the emerging memento mori art and literature, right? This intense apocalyptic mindset, this obsession with death, judgment, the end times.
Exactly. It fostered this really turbulent psychological mix. On one hand, yes, you saw intense piety, People became obsessed with securing salvation, going on pilgrimages, fearing God's wrath. There was a sense that this must be divine punishment. But on the other hand, you also saw a kind of reckless hedonism. Oh, live for today, for tomorrow we die attitude, which you also see reflected in some literature of the time. And crucially, this mass death led to widespread institutional mistrust. The church, for instance, lost thousands of experienced priests. Many of those who survived or were hastily ordained were seen as incompetent or corrupt or simply unable to explain or stop the plague. This fueled popular movements demanding more direct, personal access to faith, like the Lollards following John Wycliffe, who famously started translating the Bible into English. They used English precisely to bypass the Latin-speaking church hierarchy and spread their ideas directly to the people.
Wow. So that desire for a more individual spirituality, challenging the authority of the established, often francophone, church hierarchy, that's a clear precursor to the Reformation a century later, isn't it? And it's fueled directly by this societal trauma. But the most immediate, the most earth-shattering impact of the Black Death was economic, wasn't it? Suddenly, half the workforce is gone. The whole feudal system is fundamentally broken.
Broken is the right word. The scarcity of workers was an immediate revolutionary force. It completely upended the power dynamic between lord and peasant. This massive labor shortage meant that the surviving peasants, the skilled workers, suddenly held all the cards. They had immense bargaining power. They weren't tied to the land in the same way. They could literally walk away from their manor and find another lord willing to pay them more, offer better conditions. They could negotiate their wages, their contracts. The price of labor just skyrocketed overnight. It was a fundamental economic shift.
And the ruling class, the landowners, they panicked, right? They tried to clamp down, pass laws like the Statute of Laborers to freeze wages and force people back to work under the old terms.
They did try, desperately.
Yeah.
But you can't legislate against basic supply and demand on that scale. The economic reality had shifted too far too fast. Those laws were largely unenforceable. The genie was out of the bottle.
And this massive economic shift, this new peasant power, combined with the lingering resentment of the Norman yoke, it all leads directly to that huge social boiling point. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381. This wasn't just a riot, was it? The sources portray it as this profound expression of the new economic reality, but also centuries of simmering class resentment against the whole system, the taxes, the serfdom, the francophone elite, led by these charismatic figures like Wat Tyler and the radical priest John Ball, his famous sermon asking, "When Adam delved in Eve's span, who is then the gentleman?" That line just cuts right to the heart of it.
It absolutely does. That phrase captures the mood perfectly. It was a fundamental challenge, not just to the immediate poll tax and sparked the revolt, but to the entire inherited system of social hierarchy, of serfdom, of noble privilege. And what's really crucial for our story is that this uprising, even though it was eventually and brutally suppressed, it demonstrated the emergence of a collective, politically aware, common identity. These weren't just scattered local protests. They organized, they marched on London, they communicated their demands, spread their radical ideas, and they did it primarily in English. And look at their targets. Figures like the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury. He wasn't just the head of the church, he was also the Lord Chancellor, the King's chief minister, a powerful symbol of both the established church and the state's francophone authority. Executing him was a deeply symbolic act of rejecting that entire power structure.
It was a sign, wasn't it? A dramatic, violent sign that the vernacular voice, the English-speaking common person, could now organize politically and was powerful enough to shake the kingdom to its very foundations. The moment the conquered started to realize their own economic and potentially political power. Okay, so we've got this common identity bubbling up, politically aware, using English as the language of economic power, the language of dissent. But for English to truly take over, it needed more than just popular use, right? It needed validation. It needed someone to show it was fit for, high art, high administration. And that brings us squarely to the great literary champion of Middle English, Geoffrey Chaucer.
Chaucer arrives at exactly the right moment, doesn't he? Just in the aftermath of the Peasants' Revolt, when all these tensions are swirling. And by choosing to write his masterpiece, the Canterbury Tales, not in French or Latin, but specifically in the English dialect of the East Midlands, the dialect of London and the court, he did something truly revolutionary. He wasn't just writing brilliant poetry. He was consciously elevating the vernacular. He was demonstrating that English was a sophisticated, flexible, powerful vehicle for complex literature, absolutely on par with the established languages of the continent. He validated it.
And the Canterbury Tales itself works almost like a social and linguistic laboratory, doesn't it? Mirroring the very conflicts and layers we've been talking about.
Oh, absolutely. You see the linguistic hybridity right there on the page, used for deliberate effect. Think about the contrast he sets up. You have the Knight's Tale, starting the whole thing off. It's full of lofty chivalric romance, using lots of French-derived vocabulary. Words like honor, courtesy, adventure, destiny. Very high-flown. And then immediately after the miller interrupts, he quites the knight, answers him back with this incredibly earthy, crude, hilarious fablio. And it's packed with simple, direct, often quite vulgar Anglo-Saxon vocabulary. Words like suave, have sex, arse, dung, basic bodily functions and desires. It's a deliberate clash. Chaucer showing the full range of this new hybrid English, from the most refined, courtly sentiments to the roughest stable yard here, all within the same language, sometimes within the same conversation.
But great literature alone doesn't create a standardized national language that everyone uses for, say, legal documents or government business. The sources stress that the rise of English also needed a kind of bureaucratic revolution driven by a specific social class.
Yes, absolutely. We shouldn't overlook the perhaps less glamorous but sociologically crucial role of the gentry. These are your non-noble landowners, your minor lords, successful merchants, lawyers, administrators. This ambitious, increasingly literate, and highly functional class became the real engine of local administration and politics.
Yeah.
They were the justices of the peace, the members of parliament, and they needed consistency. They needed a standardized written language for their work. They were the ones who really pushed for and developed what we call the Chancery Standard.
Right, the Chancery Standard. This was the formalized written style used by the clerks in the Royal Chancery, the government's main administrative office in Westminster, London. Why was standardizing these, seemingly mundane documents so important?
Because these Chancery clerks were producing official documents that had to be legally valid and clearly understood across the entire country. Things like royal writs, statutes, property deeds, tax records, court judgments. Before this, written English was all over the place. Huge regional variations in spelling, grammar, vocabulary. The same word might look completely different depending on whether it was written in York or Exeter. The Chancery clerks, based in London, naturally started using the forms most common in the influential London East Midlands dialect, Chaucer's dialect, essentially. They began to smooth out the regional quirks, select the most common spellings, stabilize the grammar. This bureaucratic need for clarity and consistency created a powerful de facto written standard. This rising gentry class, using this Chancery English for their official business, effectively became the administrative engine that elevated this particular dialect, paving the way for it to become the recognized national standard for writing.
Okay, so the bureaucrats establish a written norm based on the London dialect, and then the final piece of the puzzle arrives to lock it all in place, the technological fix. William Caxton bringing the printing press to England around 1476.
Caxton is the game changer for standardization. When he set up his press, he had a massive practical decision to make. Which version of English was he going to print in? There were still lots of dialects spoken. By choosing the established, prestigious, and increasingly standardized London East Midlands dialect, the language of Chaucer, the language of the Chancery, the language of government and commerce, he effectively froze that dialect in time. His printed books, circulating widely, cemented that version of written English as the definitive standard. What Caxton printed became the basis for modern English spelling and grammar. Standardization through mass production, essentially.
And in fixing the spelling based on how words were written and perhaps spoken in his time, the printing press inadvertently preserved one of the greatest linguistic mysteries of the entire English language, the Great Vowel Shift.
The GVS, yes. The bane of English learners and spelling bee contestants everywhere. It's this extraordinary phenomenon. Over a period of about 200 years, starting roughly in Chaucer's time, so late Middle English, and continuing right through into the early modern English period, Shakespeare's time, the pronunciation of all the long vowels in English systematically shifted. They moved upwards in the mouth.
Can you give us a quick example of what that means, moved upwards?
Sure. Take a word like name. In Chaucer's time, it was pronounced something like namu or name, with a long ah sound, like in father. During the GVS, that long ah sound raced up and fronted to become the a sound we have today, name. Or think of the word goose. It used to be pronounced more like goes or gauze with a long ah or ah sound. That vowel raised up to become the oo sound we have. The key thing is, it wasn't random. The entire system of long vowels rotated upwards. So e became I, like mice from me's, oo became owl, like mouse from moose, and so on.
But crucially, the spelling didn't change to match the new sounds.
Exactly. Because Caxton and the early printers were standardizing the spelling based on the late Middle English pronunciation, before the Great Vowel Shift had fully completed its changes across the whole population. So the spelling got fixed, but the sounds kept shifting underneath it. The GVS is the single biggest reason why English spelling is so notoriously inconsistent and seems illogical compared to its pronunciation. We're basically stuck writing words, more or less, as Chaucer might have spelt them, but pronouncing them the way Shakespeare's grandchildren did. And the truly maddening, fascinating part. While linguists have meticulously tracked what happened and when, the exact trigger, the sociological reason, or the internal linguistic pressure that caused this massive systematic coordinated shift across all the long vowels, well, that remains one of the great unsolved puzzles in the history of the language. We still don't really know why it happened.
So this incredible journey through conquest, plague, trauma, rebellion, standardization, it produces this unique hybrid language. After all that, what's the lasting legacy for us today? Why does understanding this crucible period matter for the English we speak, the culture we consume right now?
Oh, the modern relevance is huge. You feel it every day. Modern English's greatest strength, its power, lies precisely in that hybridity that was forged in this period. Our ability to modulate tone, register, formality. It's almost unparalleled, thanks to those layers of synonyms we inherited, the Anglo-Saxon base, the French layer, the Latin-Greek layer, often added later for scholarship. Think about describing a ruler, like we mentioned. You can be simple and direct. Kingly, English. You can invoke authority and administration. Royal, French. Or you can aim for ultimate formality and abstraction, regal, Latin. This ability to choose the right word for the right level of formality or impact is something writers, politicians, advertisers, all of us exploit constantly, often without even thinking about it. It gives the language incredible range.
And it's not just the vocabulary, is it? The way stories were told, the emergence of complex narrative, that also seems to trace back here.
Absolutely. Think about Chaucer again. The Canterbury Tales, with its frame narrative, the pilgrimage holding together all these diverse stories from different social classes, its detailed character sketches, its blend of realism and allegory. That really provided a blueprint for the modern novel. This era explored how to tell long, complex stories about society, about individual psychology within a social context. That lineage stretches forward through the development of the novel, and you could argue even informs complex storytelling in modern forms like prestige TV series or those elaborate multi-quest video games. The way we structure long-form narratives owes a lot to this period.
Now, we should probably address that older scholarly view, the one you sometimes still hear hinted at, the idea that Middle English was somehow a degenerate phase, a bastard language maybe, corrupted by all that French influence.
Right, that's an important point to tackle. That view, which was quite common among some 19th and early 20th century scholars, is now almost universally rejected by linguists. Those older scholars tended to focus only on what was lost, the complex Old English inflections, and saw the massive borrowing from French as a sign of impurity or weakness. They kind of missed the bigger picture. The loss of those complicated endings wasn't degeneration. It was, as we discussed, a crucial step towards a more efficient, more flexible analytic structure. It actually made the language stronger, more adaptable, easier for non-native speakers to learn eventually. English shed its grammatical complexity, which ironically made it fitter for its future role as a global language. The corruption was actually adaptation and enrichment.
It's also really important, isn't it, to realize that this whole story looks very different depending on your cultural viewpoint. Let's touch on some of those contrasting perspectives our sources highlight. How, for instance, did the French traditionally view the Norman Conquest and its aftermath?
Well, from a certain traditional French or continental European perspective, 1066 wasn't necessarily seen as a foreign conquest that subjugated England. It was often framed more as a French dynastic expansion. Remember, the Normans were originally Vikings, but they had become thoroughly Frenchified in Normandy. They spoke French, their institutions were French. So from this viewpoint, the conquest was seen as bringing superior French culture, a more advanced legal and administrative system, and sophisticated continental practices to what they might have viewed as a somewhat backward, isolated Anglo-Saxon island. The narrative emphasizes the extension of Norman French power and civilization, rather than the trauma experienced by the English.
Okay. And what about north of the border? How does the Scottish perspective differ? They were right next door to this rising English power.
For Scotland, the Middle English period looks completely different. It's defined primarily by their own intense struggle for political independence against English encroachment. Think William Wallace, Robert the Bruce, the Wars of Independence. And linguistically, It's a period of deliberate cultural differentiation. As the English language began to standardize around that southern London-based dialect, the people in lowland Scotland were developing their own distinct national language, Scots, sometimes called Lowlands. Scots evolved from the northern dialects of Old English, early Middle English, but it developed along its own path with its own vocabulary, grammar, and eventually a very rich literary tradition entirely separate from Chaucerian English. So for Scotland, this era is about resisting English dominance and forging a distinct national and linguistic identity in opposition to the South. That linguistic distinctiveness remains a potent cultural marker today.
And finally, how do modern scholars, particularly those using a post-colonial critique, analyze this period?
From a post-colonial studies perspective, the Norman Conquest and the centuries that followed are often analyzed as a clear case of internal colonialism. You have a foreign military elite conquering a territory, replacing the native ruling class, imposing its own language, French, in all positions of power, law, government, high culture, and its own legal and social systems, while relegating the native language and culture, English, to a subordinate status. The lands are redistributed. The church hierarchy is replaced. From this viewpoint, the eventual resurgence of English, culminating in Chaucer and its adoption as the national language, isn't just a linguistic shift. It's read as a long, slow act of cultural resistance by the subjugated population. It's the story of the vernacular, the language of the common people, gradually reclaiming its place and power from the colonizing elite. It highlights the resilience of local culture against imposed imperial power. So when we pull it all together, when we look back across this whole deep dive, the Middle English period really stands out, doesn't it?
It's this profound, complex testament to the sheer resilience of language and of culture, even when facing centuries of political oppression. It shows us that true, lasting cultural power doesn't always reside in the decrees of the elite or the language of the conquerors. Ultimately, it often bubbles up from the vernacular, from the everyday speech of ordinary people, that chaos, that collision. It wasn't the enemy of English. In the long run, chaos was the mother of its complexity and its strength.
We've traced the incredible benefits that came out of this crucible, didn't we? The amazing lexical richness, those layers of vocabulary, the simplification of grammar that made the language so adaptable, the unexpected social mobility kicked off by the horror of the plague, even the birth of cultural traditions like chivalry and courtly love, largely mediated through French initially.
But we absolutely have to remember the profound costs and dangers too. 3 centuries of effective foreign domination, deep, rigid class stratification that was literally enforced by the language you spoke, and the brutal suppression of any dissent, whether it was spiritual rebels like the Lollards trying to read the Bible in English, or economic rebels like the peasants in 1381 demanding their rights. It was messy, it was violent, it was painful, but somehow incredibly creative at the same time.
And that very collision of cultures, that violent forging process, it created the language we are speaking right now, the language you're hearing. Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to mull over. In our own time, our era of intense globalization, mass migration, constant digital communication, we're seeing massive cultural and linguistic forces collide again. But this time, it's not usually through direct conquest like 1066. It's happening through screens, through digital proximity, through globalized markets and media.
So the question the Middle English period leaves us with is this. Will English, shaped by its history of hybridity and adaptation, continue to absorb, simplify, and integrate influences from all corners of the globe, maintaining or even expanding its dominance? Or could its sheer, overwhelming global presence actually cause other languages, perhaps those with more complex traditional structures, to simplify and retreat in the face of English dominance, much like English itself once did under the pressure of French and Latin? The story we've explored today reminds us that the dynamics of language contact, power, and cultural identity are never static. They're always in play.
A fascinating question to ponder. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the English crucible. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.